The thunder cracked as Weston Pratt's spurs clinked against the weathered floorboards of Carson City's only saloon, his shadow stretching long across the room like the reputation that preceded him. Every head turned, some in recognition, others in fear, but Weston paid them no mind as he made his way to the bar, the weight of 5 years on the cattle trails etched into the hard lines of his face. Nevada Territory, 1875. The West was still wild, still dangerous, and still a place where a man's words often carried the same deadly weight as the Colt revolver that hung at his hip. "Whiskey," he growled to the bartender, his voice rough as sandpaper from too many nights sleeping under stars and too many days eating dust. The man nodded nervously, pouring the amber liquid with shaky hands. 5 years driving cattle had hardened Weston in ways he never thought possible. At 32, he was already considered an old hand, his once bright blue eyes now permanently narrowed against sun and suspicion. His sandy blonde hair was too long, his beard untrimmed, and his manner unpolished. The trail had taken the soft edges off him, leaving only sharp corners and a sharper tongue. The saloon doors swung open again, and this time it wasn't the light that caught his attention but the woman who stepped through them. She wasn't dressed like the other women who frequented such establishments, no gaudy colors or excessive paint. Instead, she wore a simple blue dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical style, though a few rebellious curls had escaped to frame her face. Abigail Grayson had come to Carson City with purpose. At 26, she had buried both parents and was determined to make something of the small inheritance they'd left her. A bookshop, a place of stories and knowledge in a town that seemed more interested in liquor and cards. A foolish dream, perhaps, but it was hers. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the bar with an air of determination that belied her slender frame. "I'm looking for the owner of the property on Main Street. I was told he might be here." The bartender, still eyeing Weston warily, turned to her with visible relief. "That'd be Mr. Sullivan, madam. He's in the back playing cards." She nodded her thanks and was about to move away when Weston's voice cut through the air. "Sullivan's a cheat and a thief," he said bluntly, not bothering to lower his voice. "Whatever he's selling, it ain't worth what he's asking." Abigail stiffened, turning to face him fully. "I don't believe I asked for your opinion, sir." Weston took a slow sip of his whiskey, eyeing her over the rim of his glass. "Didn't say you did, just stating facts. Facts require evidence, Mr. Pratt. Weston Pratt." He set down his glass. "And my evidence is watching Sullivan fleece 3 ranchers last month before skipping town with their money. Came back once the dust settled, thinking nobody would remember." Her expression softened slightly, but her posture remained rigid. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Pratt, but I still need to speak with him. I've already put a deposit on the property." Weston stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a curse. He towered over her, his expression thunderous. "Then you're a fool. This town will eat you alive, lady. Whatever you're planning, take your money and go back east where you belong." The saloon had gone quiet. Abigail's cheeks flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. She took a step back from him, a small, involuntary movement that spoke volumes. She flinched. It wasn't much, just a slight tensing of her shoulders, a barely perceptible backward motion, but it hit Weston like a physical blow. In that moment, he saw himself through her eyes, a towering, unkempt figure looming and loud, frightening in his intensity. The realization doused his anger like water on hot coals. He hadn't meant to scare her. Warn her, yes, prevent her from making a costly mistake, certainly, but frighten her. That hadn't been his intention at all. "I apologize, madam," he said, his voice noticeably lower, softer around the edges. I spoke out of turn. Surprise flickered across Abigail's face, followed quickly by wariness. "Your concern is noted, Mr. Pratt," she said, her voice steady despite her earlier reaction. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She moved past him toward the back room, her head held high, but Weston caught the slight tremble in her hands. He watched her go, a strange feeling settling in his chest, something like regret mixed with something he couldn't quite name. He drained his whiskey and slapped a coin on the counter, suddenly eager to be anywhere but in this saloon. The night air hit him like a welcome slap as he stepped outside, the moon hanging low and full over the mountains. Weston had never considered himself a cruel man, just direct. Life on the trail didn't leave room for niceties or social graces. You said what needed saying and moved on. But that woman's flinch stayed with him, stirring memories he'd long since buried. His father's voice, loud and angry. His mother's quiet acceptance. His own childhood vow to never become that man. Yet here he was, frightening a woman he didn't even know with nothing but the harshness of his words. He pulled out a cigarette, striking a match against the wall and cupping the flame against the evening breeze. As the tobacco caught, he made a decision. He would find her tomorrow and make proper amends. Not because she needed his help, she clearly had spine enough for two, but because something in her reminded him of the man he'd once wanted to be. The man he might still become, if he remembered how to speak without drawing blood. Morning in Carson City arrived with the subtlety of a gunshot, sudden and demanding attention. Weston woke in his rented room above the livery, the familiar smells of hay and horse drifting through the floorboards. He'd slept poorly, his dreams haunted by auburn hair and flinching shoulders. After washing and shaving, a concession to civility, he rarely bothered with. He made his way to Main Street, easily spotting the property Abigail Grayson must have been referring to. It was a modest storefront sandwiched between the general store and a lawyer's office, its windows dusty with neglect. A faded "for sale" sign hung crookedly in the window, but someone had recently swept the porch. Weston hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What was he doing here? He had no business interfering in this woman's affairs. He'd be moving on soon anyway, once he'd collected payment for the cattle drive and restocked his supplies. But before he could turn away, the door opened, and there she was, Abigail Grayson, looking much as she had the night before, though perhaps more tired around the eyes. She startled when she saw him standing there. "Mr. Pratt," she acknowledged, her voice cool but not unfriendly. "Have you come to offer more unsolicited advice?" The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "No, madam. I came to apologize properly for my behavior last night. It was unwarranted." She studied him, noticing his freshly shaved face and the effort he'd made to tame his wild hair. "Apology accepted, Mr. Pratt, though I must say you don't strike me as a man who makes a habit of apologizing." This time he did smile, a brief flash that transformed his weathered face. "I'm not, but there's always a first time for everything." He gestured to the building behind her. "So you're going through with it, buying this place?" "I am." Her chin lifted slightly, a challenge in the set of her jaw. "I'm opening a bookshop." "A bookshop," he repeated, glancing at the dusty windows and warped door frame. "In Carson City?" "Yes, a bookshop in Carson City. Is there something wrong with that?" He chose his next words carefully, conscious of his tone. "Not wrong exactly, just unexpected. This town's more known for its saloons than its literary interests." "Then perhaps it's time that changed," she said, her green eyes bright with determination. "Not everyone who comes west leaves their minds behind, Mr. Pratt." "I didn't mean to suggest," he began, then stopped himself. "You're right, it's a good idea." He looked at the building again, noting the sagging corner of the roof. But Sullivan sold you a wreck. This place needs work before it can open for business." Abigail sighed, the first crack in her confident facade. "I'm aware. Unfortunately, my funds are limited after purchasing the property and ordering the initial book inventory. I was hoping to hire help, but—" She trailed off, gesturing vaguely. Weston should have walked away then. Should have tipped his hat, wished her luck, and gone about his business. But something, perhaps the memory of that flinch, perhaps something deeper, made him stay. "I could help," he said quietly, the words surprising him as much as her. "I've got some time before I head back out. I'm handy with tools." Her surprise was evident. "Why would you do that?" "Consider it penance for scaring you last night." "You didn't scare me," she said automatically, then had the grace to look sheepish at his raised eyebrow. "Well, perhaps a little. You can be rather intense, Mr. Pratt." "Weston," he corrected, his voice deliberately gentle. "If I'm going to be fixing your roof, you might as well use my given name." She hesitated only briefly. "Abigail." Then, with a small smile that transformed her serious face, "Though most people call me Abby." "Abby," he repeated, liking the way it felt on his tongue. Softer than his usual vocabulary. "I'll start tomorrow if that suits you." "It does. Thank you, Weston." As he walked away, Weston wondered what exactly he'd just gotten himself into. He wasn't a carpenter or a shopkeeper. He was a cowboy, more at home with cattle and open sky than hammers and storefronts. And he certainly wasn't the type of man who spent time with educated women who dreamed of bringing books to dusty frontier towns. Yet somehow, the prospect of helping Abigail Grayson felt right in a way few things had in recent years. Perhaps it was the opportunity to prove to her, to himself, that he was more than just a rough voice and intimidating presence. Or perhaps it was simply the way she'd looked at him when she'd smiled, like she was seeing something worth knowing beneath all his hard edges. True to his word, Weston arrived at the shop early the next morning, tools borrowed from the livery owner slung over his shoulder. Abigail was already there, sleeves rolled up as she scrubbed at years of grime on the front windows. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice low and even a conscious effort that was already becoming a habit around her. She turned, pushing a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Good morning. I wasn't sure you'd really come." "I said I would." 3 simple words that encompassed a lifetime of philosophy for Weston Pratt. A man's word was all he truly owned out here. "Yes, you did." She smiled slightly. "Well, as you can see, there's plenty to be done." "The roof needs reshingling in that corner," he finished, already assessing the work ahead. "And that door frame's warped something fierce. Windows need recaulking. Floor's got some soft spots that'll need new boards." He caught her worried expression and added, "Nothing that can't be fixed." "I hope you're right. I've put everything I have into this place." Weston nodded, understanding the weight of that statement better than she might expect. He'd risked everything more than once in his life, though usually with cattle and cards rather than books and buildings. "Why a bookshop?" he asked as he set down his tools and shrugged out of his jacket. The question had been nagging at him since yesterday. Abigail paused in her scrubbing. "My father was a teacher. My mother loved poetry. They believed in the power of words and ideas." Her voice softened with memory. "When they died influenza 2 winters ago, I decided the best way to honor them was to bring books to places that needed them. And you chose Carson City because it was far enough west to need books but established enough to support a shop, and—" she hesitated. "I needed a fresh start. Somewhere people didn't look at me with pity every time they saw me." Weston understood that, too, the need to escape, to reinvent oneself in a place where no one knew your history or your heartaches. "Well, let's make sure this fresh start of yours has a roof that doesn't leak," he said, picking up his tools again. "I'll start up top. You keep working on those windows." For the rest of the day, they worked in a comfortable rhythm, Weston on the roof while Abigail continued cleaning inside. Occasionally, she would bring him water or ask his opinion on some aspect of the store's layout, but mostly they worked in companionable silence. It was strange, Weston thought, as he hammered new shingles into place, how easy it was to be around her. He wasn't a man accustomed to female company, not the respectable kind, anyway. Yet with Abigail, conversation came naturally, even when they disagreed. And disagree, they did, especially when she outlined her plans for a reading area with comfortable chairs and a small stove for winter. "You're cutting into valuable shelf space," he pointed out when he came down from the roof late in the afternoon, his shirt damp with sweat despite the mild spring weather. "Books aren't just meant to be sold, Weston. They're meant to be enjoyed." She was sketching the layout on a piece of paper, her handwriting neat and precise. "I want this to be a place where people can discover the joy of reading, not just purchase books and leave. Noble idea, but it won't pay the bills." "Perhaps not immediately," she conceded. "But I believe it will create loyal customers in the long run. People who feel welcome here will return." He shook his head, not convinced but admiring her conviction nonetheless. "It's your shop." "Yes, it is," she agreed with a smile that took any sting from her words. "And tomorrow I'd appreciate help moving in the bookshelves. They're being delivered early." Weston hadn't planned on returning tomorrow, hadn't planned on spending more than a day on this project, but he found himself nodding anyway. "I'll be here." As he walked back to his room that evening, sore in muscles long unused to carpentry, Weston realized he'd spoken more words to Abigail Grayson in one day than he typically spoke to most people in a week. More surprisingly, he'd enjoyed it. There was something about her that made him want to explain his thoughts, to engage rather than dismiss. Perhaps it was her intelligence, so evident in everything she said. Or perhaps it was the way she listened, truly listened when he spoke, as though his opinions mattered even when she disagreed with them. Whatever it was, Weston found himself looking forward to the next day in a way he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, he was in no hurry to move on from Carson City. The bookshelves arrived as promised, delivered by a wagon from the sawmill on the edge of town. 6 heavy pine shelves, stained a rich brown and smelling of fresh varnish. Weston and the driver carried them inside, positioning them according to Abigail's careful instructions. "You've got quite the form in here," the driver commented to Weston with a grin as Abigail directed the placement of the last shelf with exacting precision. "She knows what she wants," Weston replied, not bothering to correct the assumption that he worked for her. In a way, he supposed he did, at least for now. Once the shelves were in place and the driver paid, Abigail stepped back to survey the transformation of the space. The windows now gleamed in the morning light, the floor had been swept clean, and the bookshelves stood ready for their precious cargo. "It's starting to look like a real shop," she said, satisfaction evident in her voice. "Thank you, Weston. I couldn't have managed those shelves alone." "Still plenty to do," he noted, eyeing the bare walls that needed paint and the counter area that required building. "When are your books arriving?" "Next week on the stage from San Francisco. I've ordered over 300 volumes to start." Her eyes shone with excitement. "Classics, contemporary novels, history, poetry, children's books, practical guides for farming and ranching." "Ambitious," he commented, impressed despite himself. "I told you, not everyone who comes west leaves their minds behind." She gave him a pointed look. "I suspect even hardened cowboys might enjoy a good book now and then." Weston shrugged noncommittally. "Been a while since I've read anything more complicated than a trail map or a wanted poster." "Can you read?" she asked bluntly, then immediately looked mortified. "I'm sorry, that was terribly presumptuous. Of course you can raid. I didn't mean to imply it's a fair question," he interrupted, not offended by her assumption. Many of the men he'd ridden with over the years couldn't read a word. "Yes, I can read. My mother insisted. Said no son of hers would grow up ignorant, no matter how my father felt about book learning." Something in his tone must have revealed more than he intended, because Abigail's expression softened. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," he agreed quietly. A moment of silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken understanding. "Well," Abigail said finally, "perhaps when my shop opens, you'll rediscover the pleasure of reading. I'm sure I could recommend something you'd enjoy." The idea of sitting quietly with a book seemed foreign after so many years of constant movement, but Weston found himself nodding anyway. Maybe so. They worked through the rest of the morning, Weston building a sturdy counter while Abigail painted the walls a soft cream color. Around noon, she disappeared briefly, returning with a basket from the hotel restaurant across the street. "I thought you might be hungry," she explained, setting out sandwiches and 2 bottles of sarsaparilla on a crate that served as a makeshift table. Weston realized he was famished. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Abigail spoke again. "May I ask you something, Weston?" he nodded, taking a swig of the sweet drink. "Why did you decide to help me? Truly." Her green eyes were direct, searching his face for the real answer. "It can't just be because of what happened at the saloon." Weston considered deflecting or offering a simplified explanation, but something about her directness demanded honesty in return. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "Perhaps I admire your determination, or maybe—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe I needed to prove something to myself. What would that be? That I'm not just what I seem on the surface, that there's still something in me besides trail dust and cattle drives." He shook his head, uncomfortable with his own candor. "Forget I said that. It sounds foolish when spoken aloud." "Not foolish at all," she said softly. "We all need to remind ourselves occasionally that we're more than what circumstances have made us." Their eyes met across the makeshift table, and for a moment, Weston felt as though she was seeing straight through to parts of himself he'd long since buried, the parts that dreamed and hoped and wanted more than just survival. The moment was broken by the arrival of Walter Jenkins, the town's mayor and self-appointed welcoming committee, who burst through the door without knocking. "Miss Grayson, I heard you were making progress with the shop and wanted to see for myself." The portly man beamed, looking around approvingly before his eyes landed on Weston. His smile faltered slightly. "Pratt, didn't expect to see you here." "Jenkins," Weston acknowledged coolly. He'd had run-ins with the mayor before, nothing serious, but enough to establish mutual wariness. "Mr. Pratt has been kind enough to help with the renovations," Abigail explained, standing to greet the mayor properly. "I couldn't have managed without him." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? Well, how unexpected. Mr. Pratt isn't generally known for his community spirit." He turned to Abigail with renewed enthusiasm. "Nevertheless, I'm delighted to see the progress. Carson City is in desperate need of cultural enrichment, and a bookshop is exactly the sort of establishment that will elevate our town's standing." As Jenkins continued to extol the virtues of civilization and refinement, Weston felt increasingly out of place. The mayor's pointed glances in his direction made it clear that men like Weston, rough men, trail men, were precisely the element that Jenkins believed needed elevating. When Jenkins finally took his leave, promising to return for the grand opening, an awkward silence fell over the shop. "I should get back to work on that counter," Weston said stiffly, rising from his seat. "Weston," Abigail said, her voice stopping him before he could turn away. "Please don't pay any attention to Mayor Jenkins. He's pompous and judgmental and clearly doesn't know you at all." "Knows me well enough," Weston replied, his voice harder than he'd intended. "I'm exactly what he thinks I am, just a cowboy who's more at home with cattle than cultural enrichment." "That's not true." She stepped closer, her expression earnest. "In the past 2 days, I've seen a man who works hard, keeps his word, and knows more about construction than most professional carpenters. A man who listens when I speak and treats my ideas with respect, even when he disagrees with them." She smiled slightly. "And a man who, despite his outward gruffness, has been careful not to frighten me again since that first night." Weston was caught off guard by her perception and by the way her words eased something tight in his chest. "You noticed that, did you?" "It would be difficult not to notice. You've been speaking to me like I'm made of glass," he frowned. "That's not my intention, I just don't want to." He trailed off, unsure how to explain. "Make me flinch again," she supplied gently. He nodded, uncomfortable with the conversation but unable to walk away from it. "I appreciate the consideration, Weston, but you don't need to whisper around me. I'm not as fragile as all that." She touched his arm briefly, the first time she'd initiated physical contact between them. "I was startled that night, yes. You were intimidating. But now that I know you better, I'm not afraid of you. Your natural voice won't send me running for the hills." The sincerity in her eyes made something shift inside him, a loosening of tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "Good to know," he said, his voice slightly stronger but still mindful of its impact. "Now about that counter." They returned to work, the easy rhythm between them restored. As Weston fitted boards together for the counter, he found himself reflecting on Abigail's words. It had been a long time since anyone had seen past his rough exterior to whatever still existed beneath. A long time since he'd allowed anyone to try. Yet here was this woman, educated, refined, so different from him in every way, who somehow saw something worth knowing in Weston Pratt. It was a dangerous feeling, this being seen. Dangerous because it made him want things he'd long since convinced himself he didn't need. Community. Connection. Perhaps even more. As the day waned and shadows lengthened across the newly painted floor, Weston found himself inventing tasks to prolong his time in the shop. When he finally ran out of excuses to stay, he reluctantly gathered his tools. "I'll be back tomorrow to finish the counter and start on those shelves you wanted for the children's corner," he said, surprised by how much he was looking forward to it. "I'll have coffee waiting," Abigail promised, smiling in a way that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "And perhaps, if you're amenable, we could discuss what sort of books might tempt a reluctant reader back to the written word." "I'm not much for poetry," he warned, noted. "No poetry." Her smile widened. "We'll find something that suits you, Weston Pratt. I'm quite determined." As he walked back to his room that evening, Weston realized he was smiling, a rare enough occurrence that it felt strange on his face. Stranger still was the anticipation he felt for the days ahead, days that would be filled with sawdust and paint and Abigail Grayson, determined green eyes. For the first time in years, Weston was in no hurry at all to move on. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity, as the bookshop transformed from an abandoned storefront into a warm, inviting space. Weston worked alongside Abigail each day, finding unexpected satisfaction in creating something permanent after years of transient existence. The counter was completed, smooth and sturdy. Custom shelves were built for the children's corner, lower to the ground and decorated with carved animals along the edges, a detail Weston had added on impulse, remembering a similar shelf from his own childhood. When the books arrived on the stagecoach from San Francisco, 17 crates of them, far more than Abigail had initially let on, Weston helped unpack each volume, handling them with surprising care as Abigail sorted them by category and author. "Have you read all of these?" he asked as they worked, genuinely curious about the extent of her knowledge. "Not all, but many," she admitted. "Some I ordered based on reviews or recommendations. Others because they're considered important even if they're not to my personal taste." "Like what?" She held up a thick volume. "This treatise on cattle breeding and management, for instance. Not my usual bedtime reading, but I suspect it will be quite popular among the ranchers in the area." Weston took the book from her, flipping through its pages with interest. "Looks comprehensive. Might have saved me some trouble if I'd had this 5 years ago when I started running cattle. You should borrow it then, be my first official reader." He glanced up, surprised by the offer. "Don't you need to sell it? I ordered 2 copies, anticipating interest." She smiled. "Besides, having the respected Mr. Pratt seen reading a book from my shop would be excellent advertising, don't you think?" "Respected might be overstating it," he muttered, but he tucked the book aside nonetheless. "I'll rate it. But don't expect me to write one of those fancy reviews you've been showing me." "I wouldn't dream of it," she replied, her eyes twinkling. As they continued unpacking, their hands occasionally brushed, sending an unexpected warmth up Weston's arm each time. He found himself creating reasons for these brief contacts, passing her books, reaching for the same shelf, steadying a stack that threatened to topple. Each small touch seemed to build something between them, a quiet understanding that neither was ready to acknowledge aloud. The grand opening of Grayson's books was set for Saturday, and as the day approached, Abigail grew increasingly nervous. Despite her confident exterior, Weston could see the doubt in her eyes as she rearranged displays and second-guessed her inventory choices. What if no one comes? She confided the evening before the opening, as they sat on the newly built porch steps sharing a pot of coffee. What if Mayor Jenkins is wrong and Carson City has no interest in cultural enrichment? "They'll come," Weston assured her, his voice quiet but certain. "Some out of curiosity, some because Jenkins has been talking it up all over town, and they'll stay because—" He gestured to the shop behind them, transformed by their joint efforts into something truly special. "Because you've created something worth staying for." She looked at him then, really looked at him, her expression soft in the fading light. "Thank you, Weston, not just for the reassurance, but for everything these past weeks. I couldn't have done this without you." "Yes, you could have," he said honestly. "Would have taken longer, but you'd have managed. You're the most determined woman I've ever met. Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I've enjoyed having you here, more than I expected to." The admission hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Weston felt a response rising in his throat, something dangerously close to a confession of his own growing feelings when the town clock chimed the hour, breaking the moment. "It's getting late," Abigail said, standing quickly. "I should get back to the boarding house. Big day tomorrow." Weston nodded, rising more slowly. "I'll walk you." "There's no need. It's only 3 blocks and Carson City is perfectly safe." "Humor me," he said, offering his arm without further explanation. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, her touch light but warming him through his shirt sleeve. They walked in companionable silence through the quiet streets, the setting sun painting the buildings gold and pink. When they reached the boarding house, a respectable establishment run by a widow with strict rules about male visitors, Abigail turned to face him. "Will you be at the opening tomorrow?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of vulnerability that tugged at something deep in Weston's chest. Wouldn't miss it, he promised. She smiled, relief evident in her expression. Good. I've set aside a book for you, something I think you might enjoy more than that cattle manual. Is that so? He raised an eyebrow, curious despite himself. Going to tell me what it is? Tomorrow, she said, her smile turning mischievous. Consider it an incentive to arrive early. Before he could respond, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a quick, soft kiss to his cheek. Good night, Weston, she whispered, then disappeared inside the boarding house before he could process what had happened. Weston stood frozen on the sidewalk, his hand rising unconsciously to touch the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. It had been so long since he'd experienced such a gentle gesture that he hardly knew how to respond. As he walked slowly back to his room, the memory of that brief kiss replayed in his mind. It had been innocent enough, a gesture of friendship and gratitude, nothing more. Yet it had awakened something in him that he'd long since buried. The desire for connection, for tenderness, for something permanent in a life defined by transience. Opening day dawned clear and warm, the kind of spring day that promised summer was not far behind. Weston woke early, more nervous than he had any right to be. After all, it was Abigail's shop, Abigail's dream on the line today. Yet somehow, over the past 2 weeks, it had become his dream too, or at least, his investment in her success had grown beyond simple friendship. He dressed with unusual care, selecting his newest shirt and taking time with his shaving. As he studied his reflection in the small mirror over his wash basin, Weston barely recognized himself. The hard lines of his face remained, but something had softened in his eyes. He looked less weathered, more present. When he arrived at the shop an hour before the official opening time, he found Abigail already there, arranging the front window display with painstaking care. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, a deep blue that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, which she'd styled more elaborately than usual. She looked up when the bell over the door chimed, and the smile that spread across her face at the sight of him made Weston's heart stutter in his chest. "You're early," she said, setting down the book she'd been positioning. "You mentioned an incentive," he reminded her, suddenly self-conscious under her appreciative gaze. "So I did." She moved to the counter where a wrapped package sat waiting. "This is for you. A thank-you gift, though it hardly seems adequate for all you've done." Weston took the package, surprised by its weight. Carefully removing the brown paper wrapping, he revealed not one but 2 books. The first was a handsomely bound copy of the Travels of Marco Polo, an adventure story disguised as history. The second, smaller volume was The Call of the Wild by Jack London. "I thought you might appreciate stories of exploration and survival," she explained, watching his reaction closely. "Men who faced the unknown with courage and resourcefulness, much like yourself." Weston ran his fingers over the embossed covers, touched beyond words by the thoughtfulness of her selection. "No one's given me a book since I was a boy," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "Thank you, Abby." It was the first time he'd used the shortened version of her name, and the way her eyes softened at the sound told him she'd noticed and approved. "You're welcome, Weston." She touched his arm lightly. "I hope they bring you as much joy as your help has brought me." Before he could respond, before he could find words for the feelings swelling in his chest, the shop door opened again, and Mayor Jenkins entered, followed by several other prominent citizens of Carson City. "Miss Grayson, we've come early to offer our support on this auspicious occasion." Jenkins beamed, looking around with approval before his gaze settled on Weston and the books in his hands. "Why, Mr. Pratt, I hardly recognized you without sawdust in your hair. Becoming a literary man, are we?" There was a hint of condescension in the mayor's tone that might once have provoked a sharp retort from Weston. But he was learning, slowly but surely, that not every comment required a cutting response. "Just supporting the local economy, Jenkins," he said mildly, setting the books aside. "Miss Grayson has excellent taste in literature. You do well to ask for her recommendations." Jenkins looked momentarily taken aback by Weston's civil tone, then nodded. "Indeed, I shall. Now, Miss Grayson, allow me to introduce Mrs. Harrington, president of Our Ladies Cultural Society." As more early visitors arrived, Weston stepped back, allowing Abigail to greet her first customers. She moved among them with natural grace, answering questions, suggesting titles, and creating an atmosphere of welcome that drew people further into the shop. Watching her, Weston felt a swell of pride so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. She was magnificent, intelligent, passionate, and utterly in her element among these books she'd brought to Carson City through sheer determination. The official opening time came and went, and still people continued to arrive. Word had spread quickly, it seemed, and curiosity had brought out not just the town's elite but ordinary citizens as well, shopkeepers, ranchers, even a few miners from the outskirts of town. By midday, the shop was crowded with browsers, and Abigail was making steady sales. Children sat in the reading corner Weston had built, entranced by the picture books Abigail had set out. Men clustered around the practical guides, while women explored the fiction and poetry sections. Weston moved quietly among the customers, straightening displays and answering questions when asked. Several people expressed surprise at his presence, but he ignored their curious glances, focused instead on making this day a success for Abigail. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd finally began to thin, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Weston moved to the window, his hand instinctively dropping to where his gun would normally be, though he'd stopped wearing it while working in the shop. "What is it?" Abigail asked, joining him at the window. "Sullivan," Weston said grimly, recognizing the man stumbling down the street, clearly drunk despite the early hour. "And he doesn't look happy." Before Abigail could respond, the door burst open and Thomas Sullivan lurched into the shop, his bloodshot eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. "So you did it," he slurred, gesturing wildly at the transformed space. "Turned my property into some fancy book place." "Mr. Sullivan," Abigail said calmly, though Weston could see the tension in her shoulders, "this is no longer your property. I purchased it legally, as you well know." Sullivan sneered. "For half what it's worth, now that the railroads confirmed the new spur line. You knew, didn't you? That's why you were so eager to buy. Cheated me out of a fortune." The remaining customers began to edge toward the door, sensing trouble. Weston stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Abigail. "You made the deal, Sullivan," he said, keeping his voice low and controlled despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Miss Grayson paid your asking price. Time for you to leave." Sullivan's bleary gaze shifted to Weston, recognition dawning slowly. "Pratt. Should have known you'd be mixed up in this, always sticking your nose where it don't belong." He took a stumbling step forward. "This ain't your business, Cowboy. This is between me and the lady who robbed me." "Nobody robbed you," Weston said evenly, though his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "You got your money. Now get out before you embarrass yourself further." Sullivan's face contorted with rage. "Don't tell me what to do in my own. It's not your building anymore," Weston interrupted, his voice hardening despite his effort to remain calm. "And you're frightening the customers." Sullivan looked around, seeming to notice for the first time the disapproving stares of the few remaining patrons. For a moment, it appeared he might back down. Then his gaze returned to Abigail, and something ugly twisted his features. "You think you're so clever, don't you? With your books and your fancy talk." He spat on the newly polished floor. "This town don't need your kind. Won't be long before you're running back east with your tail between your legs." Weston saw Abigail flinch at the venom in Sullivan's voice, and something inside him snapped. In 2 quick strides, he closed the distance between them, grabbing Sullivan by the collar and propelling him toward the door. "That's enough," he growled, his voice dangerously low. "You've said your piece. Now you're leaving." Sullivan struggled briefly, but Weston's grip was like iron. At the door, he leaned in close, his mouth near Sullivan's ear. "If you ever come near her or this shop again," he whispered, his voice barely audible to anyone else, "you'll answer to me, and I won't be this gentle next time." The threat was clear in his tone, and Sullivan, despite his drunken bravado, was sober enough to recognize the danger. He staggered back when Weston released him, nearly falling off the porch steps. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. With a final glare, he stumbled away down the street. Weston stood in the doorway until Sullivan disappeared around a corner, then turned back to face the shop. The few remaining customers were watching wide-eyed, and Abigail stood frozen behind the counter, her face pale. "I apologize for the disruption," she said to the customers, her voice admirably steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "Please, continue browsing, and thank you for coming today." Gradually, the tension in the room dissipated as people returned to their shopping. Weston moved to Abigail's side, keeping his voice low. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though the tightness around her mouth belied the gesture. "I knew he might be difficult when he learned about the railroad. I just didn't expect him to make a scene in front of everyone." "He's a bully and a drunk," Weston said dismissively. "No one will pay him any mind, perhaps." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to threaten him, you know. I could have handled it." "I didn't threaten him," Weston said automatically, then had the grace to look sheepish at her knowing look. "Well, not where anyone could hear, at any rate." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "What exactly did you say to him?" "Nothing that bears repeating in polite company," he admitted, "but I doubt he'll trouble you again." She studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "You were angry. He insulted you, in your own shop, on your opening day." Weston shrugged as if that explained everything, which, to him, it did. "Yet you didn't raise your voice," she observed. "I've seen you angry before, Weston. You tend to expand, become louder, larger somehow. But with Sullivan, you got quieter." Weston hadn't realized it until she pointed it out, but she was right. His instinct with Sullivan had been to lower his voice, not raise it, to use the threat of his words rather than their volume. "Guess I'm learning," he said simply. Her smile widened, warming her eyes. "Yes, I believe you are." The last customers finally departed around sunset, leaving Abigail and Weston alone in the shop. Despite Sullivan's unwelcome appearance, the day had been an unqualified success, nearly a third of the inventory sold, and promises from many customers to return. "We should celebrate," Abigail declared, closing the ledger where she'd been recording the day's sales. "Would you join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant? My treat, as a thank you for everything." Weston hesitated, suddenly aware of how this might appear to the town gossips. A respectable businesswoman dining alone with a rough cowboy would certainly raise eyebrows. "I'm not sure that's wise," he said reluctantly. "People talk in a town this size." "Let them," she said with surprising vehemence. "I'm too happy to care what anyone thinks tonight. Besides, we've been working together for weeks. Surely dinner isn't so scandalous." Put that way, it seemed foolish to refuse. And the truth was, Weston wanted nothing more than to prolong this day, to sit across from Abigail and see her face flushed with the success she so richly deserved. "Dinner it is," he agreed, "though I should probably clean up a bit first." He glanced down at his dusty boots and rumpled shirt, the result of his encounter with Sullivan. "Meet me in an hour," she suggested. "That will give me time to close up properly and freshen up myself." Weston nodded, oddly nervous at the prospect of what felt suspiciously like a date. An hour. As he walked back to his room, Weston's mind was a tangle of conflicting emotions: pride in Abigail's success, satisfaction at having contributed to it, residual anger at Sullivan's intrusion. And underneath it all, a growing warmth whenever he thought of Abigail's smile, her quick mind, the way she saw through his rough exterior to whatever remained of the man beneath. It was dangerous, this warmth. Weston had spent years avoiding attachments, moving on before roots could take hold. His life was not meant for permanence or domesticity. He was a man of open spaces and endless horizons, not settled towns and daily routines. Yet as he scrubbed trail dust from his skin and changed into his cleanest shirt, Weston found himself imagining what it might be like to stay. To see Abigail's shop flourish, to be part of something stable and growing rather than eternally transient. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it settled in his chest with surprising rightness, like a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Carson City, which wasn't saying much, but they'd made an effort with white tablecloths and decent glassware. Weston arrived precisely on time, having taken the longest route possible to avoid overthinking the evening ahead. Abigail was already seated, a vision in the same blue dress she'd worn all day, though she'd added a delicate lace collar that somehow transformed the entire garment. Her hair was slightly looser around her face, softening her features in the warm lamplight. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine expression that reached her eyes and made Weston's chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. "You clean up nicely, Mr. Pratt," she said as he took the seat across from her. "I don't believe I've ever seen your hair so neatly combed." He ran a self-conscious hand over his head, aware that he'd spent an inordinate amount of time on his appearance. "Special occasion," he said simply. "Indeed it is." She raised her water glass in a toast, to Grayson's books and to new beginnings. Weston touched his glass to hers, holding her gaze. "To new beginnings," he echoed, the words feeling significant in ways neither of them articulated. The meal that followed was the most pleasant Weston could remember in years. Abigail was animated, recounting her favorite moments from the day the young boy who'd spent his entire allowance on Treasure Island. The elderly woman who'd wept at finding a volume of poetry she'd loved in her youth. The gruff miner who'd shyly requested recommendations for improving his reading. Weston found himself talking more than usual as well, sharing stories from his years on the trail that he'd never told anyone, not just the dangerous or exciting moments, but the quiet ones too. The beauty of dawn breaking over an untouched valley. The camaraderie around a campfire after a long day's drive. The profound silence of the high country under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "You love it," Abigail observed as he described a particularly difficult mountain pass in Colorado. "The trail life. It's not just work for you, it's something deeper." Weston nodded, surprised by her perception. "There's a freedom to it that's hard to explain. No walls, no boundaries. Just you and the land and whatever you're capable of surviving. Yet here you are, building walls and boundaries for my bookshop." She tilted her head, studying him. "Why is that, I wonder?" It was a question Weston had been asking himself with increasing frequency over the past weeks. The honest answer was both simple and terrifying because of her. Because something about Abigail Grayson had made him want to stay in one place long enough to see what might develop between them. But such an admission felt too raw, too exposing for a public restaurant, so he settled for a partial truth. "Maybe I needed to remember there are different kinds of freedom," he said carefully. "Different ways to live that have their own rewards." Her expression softened, as if she understood what he wasn't saying. "And have you found those rewards worth the trade-off?" "So far," he admitted, holding her gaze. "Unexpectedly so." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Weston found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the warmth in her eyes and the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The moment was broken by the arrival of their dessert apple pie, still warm from the oven. Abigail laughed softly, the tension dissipating as they turned their attention to the food. "I should warn you," she said as she took her first bite. "Sullivan wasn't entirely wrong about the railroad. There is a spur line plan that will make Carson City more accessible from the main route. It's one of the reasons I chose this location." Weston nodded, unsurprised by her business acumen. "Smart move. More people means more potential customers." "Yes, but it also means more competition eventually. Other businesses will see the same opportunity." She hesitated, then added, "I'll need to establish myself quickly to survive long term." There was a question in her statement that Weston couldn't miss. Would he still be here when that competition arrived? Would he help her face whatever challenges came next? "You'll manage," he said, deliberately neutral. "You're resourceful." Something like disappointment flickered in her eyes, but she masked it quickly with a smile. "Yes, I am. But I've also come to value your practical perspective. You see things differently than I do. It's been helpful." "Glad to be of service," Weston replied, aware that he was retreating into formality to avoid addressing the deeper currents between them. He wasn't ready to make promises he might not be able to keep. The remainder of the meal passed pleasantly enough, though a slight distance had crept in where moments before there had been intimacy. When they finally left the restaurant, the night had turned cool, and Weston offered Abigail his coat without thinking. "Thank you," she said, slipping it over her shoulders. It engulfed her small frame, but she seemed to appreciate the gesture, pulling it more tightly around herself as they walked toward her boarding house. They moved in comfortable silence through the quiet streets, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalks. The town was settling for the night, windows glowing with lamplight, the saloon in the distance providing the only real noise. When they reached the boarding house, Abigail turned to face him, still wrapped in his coat. "I had a lovely evening, Weston. Thank you for sharing it with me." "Thank you for inviting me," he replied, suddenly awkward now that the moment of parting had arrived. "And congratulations again on the shop. It's going to be a success, I'm certain of it." She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Your confidence means a great deal to me." She began to remove his coat, but he stopped her with a light touch on her arm. "Keep it for tonight. It's cold. You can return it tomorrow." "Are you sure? Won't you need it?" "I've slept under the stars in worse weather than this," he assured her. "I'll be fine." She nodded, pulling the coat more securely around her shoulders. "In that case, thank you. It's very warm." They stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to say good night. Weston found himself studying her face in the dim light from the boarding house windows, the delicate curve of her cheek, the slight arch of her brows, the fullness of her lower lip. "Weston," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "may I ask you something?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Are you planning to leave soon, now that the shop is open and successful?" It was the question that had been hovering between them all evening, the one he'd been avoiding answering even to himself. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I should. The spring drives will be starting soon. There's good money in it, and it's what I know." "But," she prompted, sensing his hesitation, "but I find myself reluctant to go." The words came out more roughly than he'd intended, weighted with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "For the first time in years, I'm content where I am." Her eyes widened slightly, hope dawning in their green depths. "Then stay," she said simply. "At least a little longer, see where this contentment leads you." Before he could respond, she stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his, not the quick peck on the cheek from the night before, but a real kiss, soft and questioning. Weston froze for an instant, caught off guard by her boldness. Then, as if a dam had broken inside him, he responded, one hand rising to cup her cheek while the other settled at the small of her back, drawing her closer. The kiss deepened, gentle but insistent, a conversation without words that spoke of longing and discovery and the possibility of more. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unevenly, and Abigail's cheeks were flushed in the dim light. "Stay," she whispered again, her fingers lightly tracing the line of his jaw. "Please." Weston knew he should step back, should remind them both of all the reasons why this was unwise. He was a drifter, a man with calloused hands and limited prospects. She was educated, refined, building something permanent. Their worlds were too different, their futures pointed in opposite directions. But with the taste of her still on his lips and the warmth of her body still echoing through his, Weston couldn't bring himself to voice these objections. "All right," he said instead, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. "I'll stay. For now." It wasn't a promise of forever. It wasn't even a promise of next month. But it was more than he'd been willing to commit to anything or anyone in longer than he could remember. Abigail's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "For now is a good start," she said, pressing one more quick kiss to his lips before stepping back. "Good night, Weston." "Good night, Abby," he replied, watching as she disappeared into the boarding house still wrapped in his coat. As he walked back to his room, Weston felt lighter somehow, as if a burden he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. There were still questions to be answered, decisions to be made. But for tonight, it was enough to know that tomorrow would find him here in Carson City, helping a woman with determined green eyes build something lasting in a world that had always seemed too transient to hold his interest. For the first time in years, Weston Pratt was looking forward to waking up in the same place he'd gone to sleep, and not feeling trapped by the prospect. In the days that followed, Weston and Abigail established a new rhythm. He continued to help at the shop, making minor repairs and improvements while she built her customer base. But now there was a current of awareness between them, a shared secret that manifested in lingering glances, fingers brushing as they passed each other books or tools, and quiet conversations long after closing time. Word of Sullivan's outburst had spread through town, along with the news that Weston Pratt, known more for his skills with cattle than carpentry, had appointed himself unofficial protector of both the shop and its owner. This led to a surge in curious visitors, some genuinely interested in books, others simply wanting to witness the unlikely partnership for themselves. Abigail handled the attention with grace, neither confirming nor denying the rumors about her relationship with Weston. He followed her lead, keeping his feelings private even as they grew stronger with each passing day. A week after the opening, as they were closing up for the night, Abigail broached a subject they'd been dancing around. "The Founders' Day celebration is this Saturday," she said, carefully arranging a display of new arrivals. "The whole town will be there. Mayor Jenkins has asked me to set up a small booth to showcase the shop." Weston nodded, continuing to polish the counter to a high shine. Sounds like good business. It is. She hesitated, then added, I was hoping you might accompany me, not just to help with the booth, but as my escort for the dance afterward. He glanced up, surprised by the formal request. They'd been spending almost every day together, and he'd walked her home each evening, often stealing kisses in the shadows between street lamps. But they hadn't appeared together at any public social function. You sure that's wise? He asked, echoing his concern from their dinner. People already talk. Let them, she said, the same response as before, but with more conviction. I'm not ashamed of whatever this is between us. Are you? No, he said immediately, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. Not ashamed, just protective of your reputation. She smiled, moving closer until she stood directly across the counter from him. My reputation will survive being seen with you, Weston. In fact, I suspect many of the women in town are quite envious. He raised an eyebrow skeptically. Of what exactly? Of the fact that I have the attention of the most intriguing man in Carson City. Her eyes twinkled with mischief. There's quite a mystique around you, you know, the brooding cowboy with the checkered past who's suddenly revealed hidden depths. Weston snorted. I don't have a checkered past. And there's nothing mysterious about me. What you see is what you get. Is it? She reached across the counter to touch his hand, her fingers light against his skin. I think there's far more to you than meets the eye, Weston Pratt. I've been discovering new aspects every day. Her touch sent warmth spreading up his arm, making it difficult to maintain his air of detachment. Like what? Like the fact that you've been reading The Call of the Wild and leaving thoughtful notes in the margins. She smiled at his surprise. Yes, I noticed. Or the way you carved those animals on the children's shelves that took artistic skill I wouldn't have guessed you possessed. Or how you lower your voice when you're trying to be gentle, rather than raising it like most men do to be heard. Weston hadn't realized she'd been observing him so closely, noting these small details that even he hadn't fully acknowledged about himself. It was disconcerting to be known so well and strangely comforting. So, she continued when he didn't immediately respond, will you escort me to the celebration? I promise not to make you dance more than once or twice. The prospect of dancing in public made Weston's stomach clench with anxiety. He hadn't attempted such social niceties in years, if ever, but the hope in Abigail's eyes made refusal impossible. All right, he agreed, but don't blame me when I step on your toes. Been a long time since I attempted anything resembling dancing. Her smile was worth every moment of discomfort he anticipated. I'll wear sturdy boots, she promised, squeezing his hand before releasing it. Now, help me finish closing up. I want to show you something before it gets dark. Intrigued, Weston completed his tasks quickly. Once the shop was secured, Abigail led him not toward her boarding house as usual, but in the opposite direction, toward the edge of town. Where are we going? He asked as they passed the last buildings and started up a gentle slope. You'll see, she said mysteriously. It's not much further. The path wound up a small hill overlooking Carson City, eventually opening onto a clearing with a spectacular view of the town below and the mountains beyond. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and pink, while in the eastern sky the first stars were beginning to appear. I discovered this spot last week, Abigail explained, spreading a small blanket she'd carried in her basket. I thought you might appreciate it. It reminds me of how you described watching sunrise over that valley in Colorado. Weston stood transfixed, absorbing the panorama before him. She was right, there was something about the vastness of the view, the way it made human concerns seem small in comparison, that echoed his favorite moments on the trail. "It's beautiful," he said simply, sitting beside her on the blanket. "I thought we could have a small picnic," she continued, unpacking bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine. Nothing elaborate, but it seemed a shame to waste such a perfect evening indoors. The simple meal was transformed by the setting into something extraordinary. They ate and talked as the sky darkened and more stars appeared, pinpricks of light in the deepening blue. Weston found himself pointing out constellations, knowledge gleaned from nights spent navigating by the stars on long drives. "You know so much about the natural world," Abigail observed, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "It's like reading a different kind of book." "Never thought of it that way," he admitted. "Just practical information for survival." "But isn't that what books are, ultimately? Survival guides in one form or another. Ways of understanding the world and our place in it." Weston considered this, finding the comparison apt. "Suppose so, though I prefer learning directly from experience." "As do I," she said, turning to face him more fully. "Which is why I wanted to bring you here, to experience this with you, rather than just imagine it from your descriptions. The intimacy of the moment, the isolation, the beauty surrounding them, the warmth of her beside him emboldened Weston in a way the confined spaces of the town never had." He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against the softness of her skin. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for sharing this, for—" He hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't come easily to a man unaccustomed to expressing such feelings. "For seeing parts of me I'd forgotten were there." Her eyes shone in the fading light, reflecting stars and emotion in equal measure. "You've done the same for me," she whispered. "Reminded me there's more to life than books and business, that some experiences can't be found on any page." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Abigail met him halfway, her lips finding his with certainty that left no room for doubt. The kiss was different from those they'd shared before, deeper, more urgent, unfettered by the constraints of public scrutiny or the propriety of her boarding house porch. Weston's hand slid into her hair, loosening pins until auburn waves cascaded over his fingers. Abigail pressed closer, her hands moving from his shoulders to his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Weston rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by the intensity of his feelings for this woman who had so unexpectedly changed the course of his carefully unplanned life. "We should probably head back," he said reluctantly, aware of how isolated they were and how easily passion might overcome propriety. "Before Mrs. Halloway sends out a search party for her missing boarder." Abigail sighed but nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his restraint. "You're right, of course, though part of me wishes we could stay here all night, watching the stars wheel overhead." "Another time, perhaps," he said, helping her to her feet and gathering the remains of their picnic, "when circumstances are different." The implication hung between them, a future with fewer constraints, fewer boundaries between them. Neither addressed it directly, but Abigail's smile held promise that Weston found himself increasingly eager to fulfill. The walk back to town was peaceful, their fingers intertwined as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Weston felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years, possibly ever. The persistent restlessness that had driven him from place to place seemed temporarily quieted in Abigail's presence. At her boarding house, he kissed her goodnight with reluctant restraint, already looking forward to the next day and whatever new discoveries it might bring. "I'll see you in the morning," she whispered against his lips before slipping inside, leaving him standing in the soft spring night with the taste of possibilities on his tongue. The Founders' Day celebration transformed Carson City from a dusty frontier town into a bustling festival of bunting, banners, and brass bands. Main Street was closed to traffic, filled instead with booths selling everything from homemade pies to hand-tooled leather goods. Children ran between attractions, sticky with candy and excitement, while adults greeted neighbors and strangers alike with unusual goodwill. Abigail's book booth was strategically positioned near the town square where the dance would be held later. She'd created an inviting display of her most popular titles, along with a special section of children's books complete with a small reading area on a colorful quilt. Weston arrived early to help set up. His stomach knotted with nerves at the prospect of being publicly acknowledged as Abigail's escort. He'd spent an unprecedented amount of time on his appearance visiting the barber for a proper haircut, investing in a new shirt and string tie, and polishing his boots until they gleamed. When Abigail saw him approaching, her face lit up with a smile so genuine it eased some of his anxiety. She looked radiant in a pale green dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that somehow managed to look both elegant and touchable. "You look beautiful," he said simply, the words inadequate for the vision before him. "And you look very handsome," she replied, adjusting his tie with familiar ease. "I may have to fight off half the unmarried women in Carson City." "Not interested," he assured her, covering her hand with his own. "I'm spoken for." The declaration, casual as it was, brought a flush to her cheeks and a softness to her eyes that made Weston's breath catch. There was still so much unspoken between them, questions of future and permanence that neither had directly addressed, but in this moment, his commitment to her felt absolute. The day passed in a pleasant blur of activity. Abigail's booth proved popular, especially with families eager to encourage their children's education. Weston found himself unexpectedly engaged, recommending books based on his own recent reading, and even conducting an impromptu story time when Abigail was busy with customers. Several townspeople who had previously regarded him with wariness or outright suspicion now approached with friendly curiosity, seemingly reassessing the taciturn cowboy in light of his association with the respectable Miss Grayson. Weston handled these interactions with surprising patience, discovering that his tendency toward brevity could be interpreted as thoughtfulness rather than rudeness when delivered with a slight smile. As evening approached, more booths closed and the crowd migrated toward the town square, where lanterns had been strung and a platform erected for the small orchestra. Tables laden with food and drink lined the edges of the makeshift dance floor, while benches provided seating for those who preferred watching to participating. Weston helped Abigail close her booth, storing the remaining books in a secured crate until morning. As they walked together toward the dance, he offered his arm with formal politeness that made her laugh. "Such gallantry, Mr. Pratt," she teased, slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. "One might think you've been practicing." "Maybe I have," he replied, surprising her. "Might have borrowed a book on etiquette from a certain shop I frequent." Her laughter, warm and genuine, eased the last of his tension. Whatever social missteps he might make tonight, Abigail's opinion was the only one that truly mattered to him, and she seemed delighted by his efforts, however imperfect. The dance was already underway when they arrived, couples whirling to a lively tune while onlookers clapped in time. Mayor Jenkins spotted them immediately, making his way through the crowd with determined bonhomie. "Miss Grayson, Mr. Pratt, so pleased you could join us." He beamed, though his eyes flickered with undisguised curiosity as they moved between Weston's formal attire and his proprietary stance beside Abigail. The book booth was a tremendous success, I hear. Another victory for cultural advancement in our humble town. Thank you, Mayor, Abigail replied graciously. Everyone has been very supportive. Indeed, indeed. And Mr. Pratt, I understand you've been instrumental in establishing the shop. Quite the unexpected talent for carpentry and commerce. Just lending a hand where needed, Weston said mildly, refusing to rise to the bait of Jenkins' barely concealed surprise. How commendable, Jenkins turned back to Abigail. I do hope you'll save a dance for me later, Miss Grayson. For now, I must continue my rounds as host. With a slight bow, he moved away, immediately engaging another group in animated conversation. He's still trying to figure out what I see in you, Abigail murmured, amusement coloring her voice. It's driving him to distraction. And what do you tell him? Weston asked, genuinely curious. That some men speak more eloquently through actions than words, and that I prefer substance to empty charm. She squeezed his arm. Now, I believe you promised me at least one dance. Weston swallowed hard, eyeing the crowded dance floor with trepidation. Don't suppose we could wait for a slower tune? Afraid not, she said cheerfully, tugging him forward. Best to jump in while the music's lively. Any missteps will be less noticeable when everyone's moving quickly. Before he could protest further, they were on the dance floor, joining the whirling couples as the fiddles picked up tempo. Weston's initial awkwardness, stiff arms, hesitant steps, hyper-awareness of watching eyes gradually eased under Abigail's gentle guidance. You're doing fine, she assured him, smiling up at him with such genuine pleasure that he began to relax into the movement. Just follow the rhythm and trust your instincts. By the second dance, Weston had surprised himself by actually enjoying the experience. There was something freeing about the structured chaos, the predictable patterns within the seemingly random motion. And holding Abigail in his arms, feeling her warmth and seeing the joy in her face as they moved together, was worth any amount of social discomfort. As promised, she did dance once with Mayor Jenkins, and later with the elderly owner of the general store who had been one of her earliest supporters. Weston used these interludes to catch his breath and observe the celebration from the sidelines, nursing a cup of punch that had been discreetly fortified by someone with foresight and a flask. It was during one of these moments that he noticed Thomas Sullivan on the edge of the crowd, watching Abigail with undisguised malice. The man was sober tonight, which somehow made his presence more concerning than his drunken outburst had been. Weston set down his punch and began making his way through the crowd, intent on intercepting Sullivan before he could approach Abigail. But before he could reach him, Sullivan turned and disappeared down a side street, his purpose, if he'd had one beyond simple observation, apparently abandoned. Still uneasy, Weston rejoined Abigail as her dance with the general store owner ended. Sullivan was here, he said quietly, guiding her toward a less crowded area. Watching you. He left when he saw me coming. Concern flickered across her face, quickly replaced by determination. I refuse to let him spoil this evening. He's just trying to intimidate me and it won't work. All the same, I don't like it, Weston said, scanning the edges of the gathering. He seems fixated on you or the shop, or both. Then it's fortunate I have you looking out for me, isn't it? She said, her hand warm on his arm. But tonight is for celebration, not worry. The shop is successful, the town has accepted me, and I'm dancing under the stars with the man I. She paused, suddenly shy. With you, she amended, though the implication hung in the air between them. Weston felt a surge of emotion so powerful it momentarily robbed him of words. He covered her hand with his own, squeezing gently. "Abby," he began, uncertain what he meant to say but knowing it needed saying. Before he could continue, the music changed to a slower, more intimate melody. Without further discussion, he led her back onto the dance floor, drawing her close as they began to sway to the gentle rhythm. This dance was different, less about steps and patterns, more about connection. Abigail fit perfectly against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, her hand warm in his. They moved together as if they'd been doing so for years, finding a harmony that transcended the physical. "I'm falling in love with you," Weston whispered, the words emerging without conscious decision, as natural and inevitable as breathing. "Have been since you flinched that first night and made me see myself through your eyes." She pulled back slightly to look at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "And what did you see?" "A man I didn't want to be anymore. A man who'd forgotten how to speak without wounding." He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch reverent. "You reminded me there are gentler ways to be strong." "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered back, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the admission. "With your quiet strength and your unexpected gentleness. With the way you build things meant to last." The music continued around them, but they had stopped moving, lost in a moment that felt both culmination and beginning. Weston leaned down slowly, mindful of the public setting but unable to resist the pull between them. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise of more to come. As they parted, a smattering of applause broke out nearby, a few friendly onlookers who had witnessed the exchange and approved. Abigail blushed but didn't pull away, her smile radiant in the lantern light. The remainder of the evening passed in a golden haze of happiness. They danced more, ate at tables filled with friendly conversation, and eventually joined the procession to the edge of town, where a bonfire was lit to commemorate the town's founding. As sparks rose into the star-filled sky and townspeople shared stories of Carson City's early days, Weston stood with his arm around Abigail's waist, feeling for the first time in his adult life that he might have found a place worth calling home. Later, as they walked back to her boarding house, the streets quiet after the festivities, Abigail broached a subject they'd both been avoiding. "You told me you should be leaving for the spring cattle drives," she said carefully. "That there's good money in it." Weston nodded, his arm still around her waist. "Would have been leaving about now in the normal course of things." "And now?" she asked, her voice deliberately casual though he could feel the tension in her body. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Now I'm thinking there might be other ways to make a living. Ways that don't involve months away from what matters most." Hope bloomed in her eyes. "Such as Carson City's growing. That railroad spur line will bring more people, more business. They'll need someone who knows horses, maybe someone who could start a freight service between here and the main line." He shrugged, the ideas clearly still forming. "Or there's ranching on a smaller scale. Breeding stock rather than driving herds, requires less travel." "You've been thinking about this," she said, wonder in her voice. "Hard not to when the alternative is leaving you." He touched her face gently. "I told you I was content here. What I didn't say is that it's because of you. You make me want permanence, Abby. Make me want to build something lasting." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I want that too. With you." The kiss that followed was deeper than the one they'd shared at the dance, filled with promise and growing certainty. When they finally reached her boarding house, parting was more difficult than ever before. "Saturday is my day off," Abigail said as they stood on the porch, reluctant to say goodnight. Would you take me riding? Show me some of the country you love so much." "I'd like that," Weston agreed, already anticipating the pleasure of sharing his favorite landscapes with her. I know a place about an hour's ride from here. Beautiful valley, usually have it all to myself. It's a date, then. She stretched up to kiss him one last time. Good night, Weston. Good night, Abby. He waited until she was safely inside before turning away, his steps lighter than they had any right to be after a long day and several hours of unaccustomed dancing. The future, which had always been a vague and shifting concept in Weston's mind, was beginning to take more concrete form, one that included green eyes, auburn hair, and a bookshop that felt more like home than anywhere he'd been in years. Dawn on Saturday broke clear and crisp, promising a perfect spring day for riding. Weston had arranged for 2 horses from the livery his own gelding, a steady bay named Buck, and a gentle mare for Abigail who had admitted to limited riding experience. He packed saddlebags with a picnic lunch, a blanket, and at the last minute, one of the books Abigail had given him. The valley he planned to show her was perfect for reading aloud, and he thought she might appreciate the gesture. When he arrived at her boarding house, Abigail was waiting on the porch, dressed in a practical riding skirt and jacket. Her hair was braided and pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "You look ready for adventure," he commented, helping her mount the mare with careful hands at her waist. "I am," she assured him, settling into the saddle with more confidence than he'd expected. "I may not be an experienced rider, but I'm a quick learner." She proved her claim as they rode out of town, following Weston's instructions with natural ease. The mare, sensing a novice but willing rider, behaved impeccably, maintaining a steady pace beside Buck. "You're a natural," Weston observed as they left the last buildings behind and entered open country. "Sure you haven't been hiding secret riding skills?" Abigail laughed, the sound bright in the morning air. "No secrets." "But I did read a book on horsemanship last week, once you suggested this outing. Theory isn't practice, of course, but it helps to understand the principles." Weston shook his head, amused and impressed by her practical approach. "You really do believe books hold the answer to everything, don't you?" "Not everything," she admitted, giving him a sidelong glance that quickened his pulse. "Some things can only be learned through experience." The ride to the valley was pleasurable, filled with easy conversation and comfortable silences. Weston pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his travels, while Abigail asked thoughtful questions that revealed her genuine interest in understanding this world he loved. When they crested the final ridge and the valley opened before them, Abigail gasped in appreciation. It was even more beautiful than Weston remembered, a sweeping expanse of green dotted with wildflowers, a clear stream winding through its center, and rocky outcroppings providing shelter from the wind. In the distance, snow-capped mountains provided a dramatic backdrop against the blue sky. "It's magnificent," Abigail breathed, reining her horse to a stop beside his. "I understand now why you love the trail, if this is what you see every day." "Not every day," he corrected, "but often enough to make the hardships worthwhile." He pointed to a cluster of trees near the stream. "That's a good spot for our picnic. Shade for later when the sun's higher." They dismounted by the stream, Weston helping Abigail down with hands that lingered at her waist slightly longer than necessary. He unsaddled the horses and hobbled them in a grassy area, while Abigail spread the blanket beneath the largest tree. The morning was spent exploring the valley, walking alongside the stream, identifying wildflowers with the help of a small book Abigail had brought, and simply enjoying the pristine beauty of a place largely untouched by human presence. When hunger finally drove them back to their picnic spot, they ate with the hearty appetite that comes from exercise in fresh air. Cold chicken, bread, Cheese and apples tasted like a feast in such surroundings. After they'd eaten, Weston leaned back against the tree trunk, stretching his long legs out on the blanket. Abigail sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, her face tilted up to catch dappled sunlight through the leaves above. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said quietly. "For sharing this with me." "Thank you for wanting to see it," he replied. "Most people I've known prefer town comforts to open country. I can appreciate both. The bustle of town has its own energy and purpose, but there's something clarifying about spaces like this. As if the very air is cleaner, not just physically but spiritually." Weston nodded, understanding exactly what she meant, though he'd never articulated it so eloquently himself. It puts things in perspective, makes human concern seem smaller. Yet paradoxically, it makes genuine human connections feel more significant. She turned to look at him directly. "Don't you find that's true? That who you're with matters more than where you are or what you possess?" "I do now," he said honestly. "Though it took meeting you to make me realize it." She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Weston Pratt, I do believe you're becoming poetic." "Don't tell anyone," he said with mock seriousness. "Would ruin my reputation completely." Abigail laughed, leaning more comfortably against his side. "Your secret is safe with me. Though I must say, I rather like this reflective side of you. You bring it out in me," he admitted. "Make me think about things I usually just take for granted." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the stream and the occasional call of birds overhead. Eventually, Weston reached into the saddlebag beside him and withdrew the book he'd packed. "Thought you might enjoy this," he said, slightly self-conscious as he handed it to her. "Being out here reminded me of some passages." Abigail took The Call of the Wild with evident delight. "You've been reading it. Finished it last night, actually." He tapped the cover. "Remarkable story. Made me think about the balance between civilization and wildness in all of us. That's exactly what London intended, I think." She opened the book, finding one of the passages he'd marked. "Would you like me to read some aloud? This spot seems made for storytelling." "I'd like that," Weston agreed, settling more comfortably against the tree. Abigail began to read, her voice clear and expressive, bringing the words to life in a way that gave them new meaning. Weston closed his eyes, letting the combination of her voice, the setting, and the powerful story wash over him. When she finished the chapter, he opened his eyes to find her watching him, her expression soft with an emotion that made his heart expand in his chest. "What?" he asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing, just—" She set the book aside, moving closer. "I love seeing you like this, at peace. It suits you." "You suit me," he said simply, the words emerging without thought or filter. "Better than I could have imagined anyone would." The kiss that followed was inevitable, a natural progression of the connection between them. Unlike their previous encounters, constrained by public settings or the propriety of her boarding house porch, here there were no boundaries save those they chose to maintain. Abigail's response was immediate and uninhibited, her arms winding around his neck as she shifted to face him more fully. Weston pulled her closer, one hand at the small of her back, the other tangling in her hair as pins gave way and her braid began to unravel. The kiss deepened, passion building between them with an intensity that both exhilarated and alarmed. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, and Abigail's hair had come completely loose, flowing over her shoulders in waves of auburn. "We should probably—" Weston began, though he made no move to increase the distance between them. "Probably," she agreed, her eyes darkened with desire but clear with certainty. "But I don't want to stop." The simple admission hung between them, weighted with implications. Weston studied her face, reading the trust there alongside desire. "Abby," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to be sure, because once we cross this line—" "I am sure," she interrupted, her hand coming to rest against his cheek, "of you, of us, of what I want." "Which is—" "Everything," she whispered. "A future, a life together, not just stolen moments and goodnight kisses on the porch." The directness of her answer stole his breath. It was, he realized, exactly what he wanted too, had been wanting since that night on the hill overlooking Carson City, perhaps even earlier. "I want that too," he admitted, turning his face to press a kiss into her palm. "More than I've ever wanted anything." "Then show me," she said simply, drawing him back to her. What followed was a discovery of each other that transcended physical desire, though that was certainly present. Each touch, each whispered endearment, each moment of vulnerability freely offered and reverently received, built something between them that Weston had never experienced, a connection that felt both sacred and primal. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms on the blanket, Abigail's head pillowed on his chest, his hand stroking slowly through her unbound hair. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves above them, painting patterns on their skin. "I love you," Weston said, the words that had been building in him for weeks finally finding voice. "More than I thought possible." Abigail raised her head to meet his gaze, her eyes luminous with happiness. "I love you too. Have since you started whispering instead of shouting." He chuckled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "That was a turning point, wasn't it, when you flinched and I realized how I must sound to others, to you?" "You've never frightened me since," she said softly. "Even when you were forcefully removing Sullivan from the shop, there was control in your anger, precision. Like you'd measured exactly how much force was necessary and didn't exceed it." "I never want to be the kind of man who uses his strength or his voice to intimidate," Weston said, the statement both confession and promise. "Especially not with you." "You're not," she assured him. "You're the gentlest man I know beneath that gruff exterior." They stayed in the valley until late afternoon, reluctant to leave their private paradise, but aware of the ride back and the proprieties that must be maintained. As they dressed and repacked their belongings, Weston found himself planning the conversation he needed to have with Abigail about permanence, about future, about making official what they both clearly wanted. The ride back to Carson City was quiet but companionable, each lost in thoughts that occasionally surfaced in shared smiles or brief touches as their horses walked side by side. The sun was setting as they approached town, painting the buildings in warm golden light that seemed a fitting end to a perfect day. They had just reached the outskirts when a rider came galloping toward them, his horse lathered with the effort of speed. Weston recognized Henry, the young man who helped at the livery. "Mr. Pratt," Henry called, reining his horse to a sliding stop beside them. "Miss Grayson, thank goodness I found you. It's the bookshop, there's been a fire." The next hours passed in a blur of smoke, shouting, and frantic activity. By the time they reached Main Street, the fire was mostly contained. The bucket brigade had prevented it from spreading to adjacent buildings, but Grayson's Books was a charred shell, the interior gutted by flames that had consumed nearly everything inside. Abigail stood on the street watching as the last wisps of smoke rose from the blackened timbers, her face pale with shock. Weston kept his arm around her shoulders, a steady presence as she absorbed the magnitude of her loss. Mayor Jenkins approached, his usual bombast subdued by the gravity of the situation. "Miss Grayson, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am. The entire town shares your distress." "What happened?" Weston asked, his voice carefully controlled though rage simmered just beneath the surface. This was no accident, not with the shop closed and Abigail known to be away for the day. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. It appears to have been deliberately set. The fire marshal found evidence of coal oil poured through the mail slot. And there was. He hesitated, glancing at Abigail with concern. There was what? She prompted, her voice steadier than Weston would have expected given the circumstances. A message, Jenkins admitted reluctantly. Painted on the wall behind the shop before it was set alight. Go back east where you belong. The same words. The same words Sullivan said to me on opening day, Abigail finished, her expression hardening. Has he been found? Sheriff's looking for him now. He wasn't at his usual haunts. Weston's arm tightened around Abigail's shoulders, his jaw clenched with suppressed fury. If he found Sullivan before the sheriff did. Weston, Abigail said quietly, seeming to read his thoughts, this isn't your fault. I should have taken his threats more seriously, he replied, self-recrimination evident in his tone. Should have made sure he couldn't hurt you. You couldn't have known he'd go this far. She turned to face him fully, her hands coming to rest on his chest. And he hasn't hurt me, not really. The shop can be rebuilt, the inventory replaced. What matters is that no one was injured. Her resilience in the face of such devastation only increased Weston's admiration for her and his determination to ensure Sullivan paid for what he'd done. Mayor Jenkins, Abigail continued, turning back to the portly man who was watching their exchange with poorly concealed curiosity. Is there anything salvageable? I'm afraid not, my dear. The fire was quite thorough. Jenkins hesitated, then added with evident discomfort, there is also the matter of rebuilding. Insurance will cover some costs, but with the increased price of lumber due to the railroad construction. I understand, Abigail said, her voice tight but controlled. Thank you for your concern. If you'll excuse us, I think I need to rest. It's been quite a day. As they walked away from the smoldering ruins, Weston could feel the tension in her body, the rigid control she was maintaining in public. He guided her toward the boarding house, matching his pace to hers, offering silent support until they were out of earshot of the curious onlookers. You don't have to be strong right now, he said quietly as they turned onto a side street. Not with me. The permission was all she needed. A sob escaped her, then another, and suddenly she was weeping in earnest, her face pressed against his chest as grief overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. Weston held her, murmuring words of comfort, his hand stroking her back as she released the emotions she'd been holding at bay. He led her to a nearby bench, cradling her against him until the storm began to subside. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. I didn't mean to fall apart like that. Don't apologize, he said firmly. You've lost something precious. You're entitled to grieve. She nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks with trembling fingers. It's not just the books or the building, though those hurt terribly. It's the dream bringing literature to a place that needed it, making something lasting. She looked up at him, fresh tears threatening. I was so proud of what we'd built, Weston. I know. He brushed a strand of hair from her damp cheek. And you should be. It was beautiful. Now it's gone. And even if I wanted to start over, Jenkins made it clear that rebuilding would be more expensive than I can afford. She sighed, leaning against him wearily. Perhaps Sullivan was right. Perhaps I should go back east where I belong. No, Weston said, the single word emerging more forcefully than he'd intended. He's not right. You belong wherever you choose to be, and you've chosen Carson City. A choice that's been rather forcefully rejected, it seems. By one bitter, jealous man, not by the town. Weston's mind was working rapidly, possibilities and plans taking shape. The shop can be rebuilt, Abby. I have savings, not a fortune, but enough to make a start. And the people here value what you were creating. They'll help. She pulled back slightly to study his face. You would do that. Invest your savings in rebuilding my shop, our shop, he corrected. If you'll have me as a partner, in business and... He hesitated, the words he'd been planning to say in a very different context now emerging in the aftermath of disaster. And in life, her eyes widened, surprise momentarily displacing grief. Weston, are you? Proposing? Yes. He took her hands in his expression serious but tender. Not how I planned, it was thinking more along the lines of sunset over that valley, maybe flowers, definitely not sitting on a bench while you're crying over arson. But the feeling's the same, regardless of setting. He squeezed her hands gently. I love you, Abigail Grayson. Want to build a life with you, a bookshop, a home, whatever future we decide on together. Will you marry me? Fresh tears welled in her eyes, but these were different, bright with something other than sorrow. Yes, she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she repeated, yes, Weston Pratt, I will marry you. He kissed her then, a gentle affirmation of promises made and futures entwined. When they parted, Abigail's smile was small but genuine, the first glimpse of hope since they'd received news of the fire. It won't be easy, she warned. Starting over. Facing whoever might support Sullivan's views even if they didn't participate in his actions. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Weston replied. But we'll do it together. And I promise you, Abby, Carson City will have its bookshop again, a better one than before. As they continued toward the boarding house, plans already forming between them, Weston felt a fierce protectiveness coupled with absolute certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, rebuilding, confronting prejudice, creating a future in a town still finding its identity, they would face them as partners. And if part of that partnership involved ensuring Thomas Sullivan faced justice for his actions, well, Weston was more than prepared for that particular challenge. Sullivan was found the next morning at a camp outside town, attempting to flee the territory. The sheriff, armed with evidence from the fire marshal and witnesses who had seen Sullivan purchasing coal oil the day before, arrested him without incident. The trial was brief but thorough. Multiple witnesses testified to Sullivan's threats against Abigail, his bitter complaints about being cheated, despite receiving full asking price for the property, and his frequent drunken assertions that book-learning women had no place in the West. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, sentencing Sullivan to 5 years in the territorial prison, the courtroom erupted in approving murmurs. It was, Weston thought as he squeezed Abigail's hand beside him, a clear statement of where Carson City stood on the matter of progress and civilization. The rebuilding of Grayson's books began the very next day, with volunteers from throughout the town offering labor, materials, and support. What had been Weston and Abigail's private project was now a community endeavor, symbolizing Carson City's commitment to growth and education. Mayor Jenkins, ever attuned to political opportunity, organized a town meeting where it was unanimously decided that the new shop would include a lending library section funded by municipal taxes, a first for the territory, and a source of considerable civic pride. Publishers in San Francisco and Denver, hearing of the disaster and subsequent community response, donated books to help replace the lost inventory. Several even offered advantageous terms for future orders, recognizing the publicity value of supporting such a visible symbol of Western cultural development. Through it all, Weston and Abigail worked side by side, their engagement the subject of warm congratulation rather than the scandal some might have predicted. The differences between them, education, background, temperament, were increasingly viewed as complementary strengths rather than obstacles. As summer progressed into early fall, the new Grayson's books took shape larger than before, with a dedicated children's area, a substantial lending library, and comfortable reading nooks throughout. The living quarters above the shop were expanded as well, designed for a family rather than a single proprietor. On a crisp October morning, with the aspen trees turning gold on the surrounding hillsides, Weston stood beside Abigail on the porch of their newly completed building, watching as the final sign was hung above the door, Grayson and Pratt Booksellers and Lending Library. "What do you think?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they admired the product of months of labor. "It's perfect," she said, leaning against him contentedly. "Better than I could have imagined." "The inside's not quite finished," he reminded her, practical as always despite the pride evident in his voice. "Still need to arrange the shelves exactly how you want them, and the new shipment from San Francisco won't arrive until next week." "Details," she said with a wave of her hand. "The important parts are complete." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with happiness. "We've built something lasting, Weston. Together." "Yes," he agreed, drawing her closer. "We have." The wedding took place the following weekend in the town square where they had danced at the Founders' Day celebration. The entire town turned out, the ceremony followed by a feast and celebration that lasted well into the evening. Abigail was radiant in a gown of ivory silk, her auburn hair adorned with wildflowers gathered from the valley where they had first declared their love. Weston, despite his initial discomfort at being the center of attention, stood tall and proud beside her, his voice clear and unwavering as he spoke his vows. "I promise to listen more than I speak," he said, the words written from his heart rather than borrowed from tradition. "To build rather than wander, to cherish your mind as much as your heart, and to whisper my love to you every day for the rest of our lives." Abigail's own vows matched his in sincerity and personal meaning. "I promise to value action as much as words, to find home wherever we are together, to respect your strength and support your gentleness, and to listen for the truth in your whispers when others hear only silence." As they sealed their promises with a kiss, cheers erupted from the assembled townspeople, a community that had embraced both the bookish woman from the East and the taciturn cowboy, who had found his voice through loving her. The reception that followed was filled with music, dancing, and stories some read aloud from favorite books, others shared from personal experience. It was, many would later say, the perfect blending of refinement and frontier warmth, much like the couple it celebrated. When Weston and Abigail finally slipped away as evening deepened into night, they walked not to the boarding house or Weston's rented room, but to their new home above the bookshop. "Welcome home, Mrs. Pratt," Weston said softly as he carried her across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in their private sanctuary. "It has a nice ring to it," she admitted, her arm still around his neck. "Though I hope you don't mind that the shop still carries my maiden name." "Grayson and Pratt has a better sound than just Pratt's books," he agreed with a smile. "Besides, it was your vision first. I'm just the lucky man who gets to share it with you." Later, as they lay tangled in each other's arms in their new bed, Weston marveled at the journey that had brought them here from a harsh exchange in a saloon to a partnership that encompassed every aspect of life. "What are you thinking about?" Abigail asked, her head resting on his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "How different my life would be if you hadn't flinched that night," he admitted. "If I hadn't seen myself through your eyes and decided I wanted to be better." "I think you were always this man," she said, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "You just needed someone to remind you." "Perhaps," he conceded. "Or perhaps I needed someone worth changing for." She raised herself on one elbow to look into his face, her expression serious despite her smile. "You didn't change who you are, Weston. You just found a different way to express it. Strength doesn't have to roar to be powerful. Sometimes the most important words are the ones spoken softly. Like 'I love you,'" he whispered, proving her point. "Exactly like that," she agreed, leaning down to kiss him. "And I love you too. Always." As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Weston reflected that some journeys weren't about distance covered but depth discovered. His had led him not across the continent but into himself, and to the woman who had taught him that the truest strength lay not in volume but in sincerity, not in harshness but in clarity of purpose. In the years that followed, Grayson and Pratt booksellers became a cornerstone of Carson City's growing cultural life. The lending library expanded, eventually requiring its own building adjacent to the bookshop. Reading clubs formed, author visits were arranged, and literacy rates in the region rose steadily. Weston did establish a freight business, using his knowledge of horses and terrain to create reliable transportation between Carson City and the main railroad line. The combination of Abigail's bookshop income and his freight company provided comfortably for their growing family, first a daughter with her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes, then twin boys who combined their parents' love of adventure with a deep appreciation for stories in all forms. On quiet evenings, when the shop was closed and the children finally asleep, Weston and Abigail often sat on their porch overlooking Main Street, watching as Carson City transformed from frontier outpost to established town. They would talk about books and business, children and community, their voices low and intimate in the gathering darkness. And sometimes, when the moment called for it, Weston would lean close to Abigail's ear and whisper the words that had changed his life, words of love and commitment, of dreams shared and promises kept. Words that needed no volume to convey their power, spoken by a man who had learned that true strength lay not in intimidation but in tenderness. A man who had been rough with words until she flinched and he learned to whisper.